Adams County, Mississippi, 1841. The Thornhill Plantation sat on 1,200 acres of prime cotton land, worked by 63 enslaved souls. When the master died suddenly of yellow fever, his widow Catherine made an announcement that shocked every plantation in the county. She would reward her most productive slave with a night in her bed, not as punishment, not as humiliation, as reward. What happened in that bedroom, and in the months that followed, would expose the darkest truth about power, consent, and what white women could do to black men when no one was watching. Catherine Thornhill was 34 years old when her husband James died, leaving her alone with a plantation she barely understood and debts she'd never known existed. James had been a brutal master, the kind who believed the whip solved every problem, who worked his slaves from dawn until they collapsed, who saw human beings as livestock to be used until they broke. But Catherine was different. At least, that's what she told herself. She'd grown up the daughter of a Charleston merchant, educated in a convent school, taught that slavery was regrettable but necessary, that kind treatment was a Christian duty. She'd married James at 19, moved to his Mississippi plantation, and spent 50 years watching him brutalize people while she looked away and called it survival. Now he was dead, and she was in control. The overseer, a violent drunk named Crawford, expected her to continue James's methods. The neighboring planters expected her to fail and sell out within a year. But Catherine had other ideas. She believed she could be a different kind of master, benevolent, fair, rewarding good behavior rather than just punishing the bad. It was a philosophy that sounded enlightened in theory. In practice, it became something far more sinister. The plantation's most productive worker was a man named Jacob, 28 years old, who'd been born on the property and knew cotton cultivation better than any man, black or white, in Adams County. He could judge soil conditions by feel, predict weather by watching birds, organize work crews with efficiency that amazed even Catherine. Under James's brutal regime, Jacob had kept his head down and worked. Knowing that excellence might earn him slightly less brutality, Catherine noticed him immediately. Not just his productivity, but his intelligence. The way he solved problems, anticipated needs, managed complex tasks without supervision. Within a month of James's death, she'd made Jacob a driver, giving him authority over other slaves and exempting him from the worst field labor. It should have been a promotion. In Catherine's mind, it was a gift. To Jacob, it was a more complicated prison. Being a driver meant enforcing Catherine's will on his own people. It meant using the whip on men he'd known since childhood when they didn't meet quotas. It meant betraying his community to survive. And Catherine, in her willful blindness, saw his compliance as loyalty, his survival as gratitude. 3 months after James's death, Catherine called a meeting of all 63 enslaved people in front of the main house. It was September, the brutal heat of Mississippi summer finally breaking into something bearable. The slaves assembled in the yard, exhausted from harvest season, wary of whatever new pronouncement their mistress had prepared. Catherine stood on the porch in her black mourning dress, looking down at the assembled faces. Crawford, the overseer, stood beside her, sweating through his shirt, hand resting on the whip at his belt. "I am not my husband," Catherine began. "I believe in reward, not just punishment. I believe in recognizing excellence. This year's cotton harvest has exceeded expectations, and one man deserves the credit. Jacob has worked harder, smarter, and more loyally than anyone else on this plantation." Jacob stood in the crowd, feeling every eye turned toward him. Praise from the mistress was dangerous. It created resentment, marked you as too close to the master class, made you a target. Therefore, Catherine continued, "I'm rewarding Jacob's service. Tonight, he will have privileges that no slave on this plantation has ever received. He will dine in the main house, sleep in comfort, and be treated as an honored guest for one full night." The silence that followed was absolute. The enslaved people understood immediately what the white overseers didn't. This wasn't a reward. This was a horror wearing the mask of generosity. Crawford laughed, a harsh barking sound. "Mistress, you can't be serious. Bring a buck into the house? Sleep under the same roof? I am entirely serious, Mr. Crawford. And you'll show Jacob the respect his work has earned, or you'll find employment elsewhere." That evening, as the sun set over the cotton fields, painting the sky blood red, Jacob was brought to the main house. He'd been given time to wash, provided with clean clothes, simple but better than field clothes. Every step toward that house felt like walking to his own execution. Catherine met him in the entrance hall, smiling with what she believed was kindness. "Jacob, welcome. You've earned this honor. Tonight, you're not a slave. You're a guest in this home." But he was still a slave. They both knew it. No matter what pretense Catherine constructed, the reality remained. She owned him. She could have him killed with a word. She could sell his mother, his sisters, his friends. This reward was as much an act of violence as anything her husband had done. just wrapped in prettier language. Dinner was served in the formal dining room. Catherine sat at one end of the long table, Jacob at the other. An absurd distance between the house slaves served food. Their faces carefully blank, but Jacob could feel their judgment, their fear, their understanding that whatever happened tonight would ripple through the entire plantation. Catherine talked throughout the meal. About her childhood in Charleston, about literature and music, about her dreams for making the plantation more humane. Jacob ate in silence, responding with yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am when required, watching her perform this elaborate theater of equality while ignoring the fundamental inequality of a meal where one person owned the other. After dinner, Catherine led him to the library. She poured herself brandy, offered him some, looked offended when he politely refused. She showed him her books, mostly religious texts and romantic novels, and seemed genuinely surprised that he couldn't read. James never allowed education for the slaves, she said, as if this was her husband, failing alone, and not the foundational logic of the entire system. Perhaps I should change that. Would you like to learn to read, Jacob? If it pleases you, ma'am. I'm asking what you want. I want what you want, ma'am. That's what slaves do. The honesty of it seemed to surprise her. She looked at him carefully for the first time, really looked as if seeing past her own narrative of benevolence to the man standing before her. You don't feel honored, do you? By tonight, I feel what you want me to feel, ma'am. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I can give. Catherine drank her brandy in silence, then set down the glass with deliberate care. I'm going to be honest with you, Jacob. I'm lonely. My husband is dead. I have no children. I run this plantation alone, with no companionship, no one to talk to as an equal. Tonight isn't just about rewarding you. It's about my need for human connection. Jacob said nothing. What could he say? She was confessing her loneliness to a man she owned, as if that ownership didn't make any connection between them impossible. I want you to stay tonight, Catherine continued. In the guest room. We'll talk more in the morning. Perhaps about ways to improve conditions for everyone on the plantation. Your insights could be valuable, she was offering him. Influence, trying to frame this as a partnership. But Jacob understood the real transaction. She was buying his complicity with small mercies, making him responsible for his own oppression by giving him the illusion of choice. He was shown to a guest room, luxurious by any standard. Feather mattress, clean sheets, a room to himself. The kind of comfort he'd never experienced. And it felt like a trap, because that's exactly what it was. Around midnight, Catherine knocked on his door. Jacob was still awake, sitting on the edge of a bed, unable to sleep in the strange room filled with his master's possessions. When he opened the door, Catherine stood in her nightgown, a candle in her hand, her face showing something between determination and desperation. May I come in? It wasn't a request. He stepped aside. She entered, set the candle on a table, and turned to face him. I'm going to be direct, Jacob. I find you attractive, intelligent, capable. And I'm a widow with needs that society says I can't acknowledge, but which exist nonetheless. Jacob's heart pounded. He understood now. Understood what this reward really was. Not dinner and conversation. This, his body, taken under the pretense of consent. Ma'am, I'm not forcing you. She said it so earnestly, as if that made it true. I'm offering. If you want to return to your quarters, you can. But if you stay, I promise advantages. Easier work, better provisions, perhaps eventual freedom, if you please me sufficiently. Freedom. The word hung between them like poisoned honey. She was offering what every enslaved person dreamed of, but attaching it to violation of his body, making his degradation the price of liberation. And if I refuse? Jacob asked quietly. Catherine's face hardened, just for a moment, before softening again into that mask of benevolence. Then you return to the fields tomorrow as if tonight never happened. No punishment. I'm not my husband, Jacob. I don't brutalize people for disappointing me. But they both knew that was a lie. She might not use the whip directly, but she controlled every aspect of his existence. Refusal meant staying in bondage. Refusal meant watching any chance of freedom disappear. Refusal meant his mother, his sisters, his friends continuing to suffer, while he lost the one opportunity to possibly improve their conditions. It wasn't a choice. It was coercion dressed in the language of consent. I'll stay, Jacob said, the words tasting like ash. What happened that night, I won't detail explicitly, but understand this. Catherine believed it was an affair, a passionate connection between two people drawn together despite society's rules. She convinced herself that Jacob wanted her, that his participation was genuine desire rather than survival strategy. Jacob understood it for what it was. Rape. Not violent rape with physical force, but rape nonetheless. Because consent cannot exist when one person owns the other. Because yes, spoken under threat of continued enslavement, is not yes at all. Because every touch, every kiss, Every moment of false intimacy was extracted through the power differential that made refusal impossible. In the morning, Catherine was glowing. She spoke of continuing their arrangement, of Jacob becoming her confidant and lover, of the unique understanding they shared. She gave him gifts, better clothes, a pocket watch that had belonged to her husband, promises of continued favor. Jacob returned to the slave quarters carrying those gifts like evidence of his own degradation. The other slaves saw immediately what had happened. Some looked at him with pity, others with anger, seeing him as corrupted, too close to the mistress, a potential informant. His mother wept when she saw the pocket watch, understanding that her son had been forced to sell himself for survival. The arrangement continued for 9 months. Catherine would summon Jacob to the main house 2 or 3 times a week, always at night, always under the pretense of consultation about plantation business that inevitably ended in her bedroom. She convinced herself they were lovers. He knew he was being used. The other slaves' resentment grew. Jacob's authority as a driver became tainted by his relationship with Catherine. When he enforced work requirements, people whispered that he did it to please his mistress in bed. When he tried to show mercy, they accused him of performing benevolence to maintain his privileged position. He was isolated from his community, trapped in Catherine's delusion, unable to refuse without losing everything. Then, Catherine became pregnant. She realized it in June 1842, 9 months into their arrangement. The pregnancy threw her into a panic. A white widow pregnant with no husband meant scandal. A white widow pregnant by her slave meant social destruction, possible criminal charges, almost certain violence against Jacob. Catherine called Jacob to the house one evening and told him the news. Her face was pale, her hands shaking. "I'm carrying your child," she said, as if it were a shared responsibility rather than the consequence of her repeated violations of him. Jacob felt his world collapse. A child meant permanent connection, meant Catherine would need to conceal the pregnancy or explain it somehow. Meant danger for him regardless of what she chose. "What will you do, ma'am?" "I don't know. I could say it's James's, that I was pregnant before he died, but the timeline doesn't work. Too many months have passed. I could claim a mysterious illness, go away for a few months, but that still leaves the question of what happens when the child is born." She looked at him expectantly, as if he should have solutions, as if he bore equal responsibility for a situation she'd created through her abuse of power. "I could send you away," Catherine continued, thinking aloud, "sell you to a plantation in Louisiana or Texas, far enough that no one would make connections. The child would be raised as white, no one would know." "You'd sell me?" The words came out before Jacob could stop them. "To protect us both, to protect the child. Don't you see, Jacob, if anyone discovers the truth, you'll be killed. They'll lynch you for touching a white woman, for defiling me. I'm trying to save your life." She was rewriting the narrative again, making herself the savior, making her plan to sell him away from everyone he'd ever known into an act of mercy, making the rape she'd committed into something he should be grateful for surviving. "And what about the child?" Jacob asked. "You'd raise my child as white while keeping my people enslaved. What choice do I have? The child will have opportunities as white that it could never have as black. I'm giving our child a future." "Our child?" Jacob's voice was flat. "You raped me for 9 months, got pregnant, and now you're selling me away while keeping the baby. And you're calling this mercy?" Catherine's face went white, then red. "I never raped you. You wanted this as much as I did. You came to my bed willingly, because you owned me. Because saying no meant staying enslaved forever. Because you held my freedom and the safety of everyone I love hostage to your needs. That's not consent, ma'am. That's force." For a moment, truth hung between them. Catherine's face showed recognition, horror at what she'd done, acknowledgement of the violation she'd committed. Then the shutters came down, the protective delusion reasserted itself. "Get out," she said coldly. "You're being sold to a plantation in Louisiana. Effective immediately. And if you ever tell anyone about this, I'll have you hunted down and killed. Do you understand me?" "Yes, ma'am." "I understand perfectly." Jacob was sold 3 days later to a cotton plantation in northern Louisiana, 300 miles from everyone he'd ever known. Catherine told the other slaves he'd tried to run away, that she'd been merciful in selling him rather than having him whipped to death. The child was born in January 1843. Catherine claimed it was her late husband's, conceived shortly before his death. The baby was a boy, light-skinned enough to pass as white if no one looked too closely. She named him James, after her dead husband, and raised him as her legitimate son and heir. The boy grew up never knowing his father was enslaved, never knowing his mother had raped that father repeatedly, never knowing his entire identity was built on violence and lies. Catherine lived another 34 years. dying in 1875 at age 68. She was remembered in Adams County as a kind mistress who'd successfully run her plantation alone, who'd treated her slaves with relative mercy, who'd raised a fine son despite being widowed young. No one remembered Jacob. No one, except the slaves who'd watched it happen, who whispered the truth among themselves, who'd passed down the story through generations as a warning about what white women could do when they had absolute power over black bodies. Jacob survived in Louisiana, worked cotton until his back broke, lived through the Civil War and Emancipation, died in 1879 as a sharecropper on the same land he'd once worked as a slave, technically free but practically still bound. He never saw his son, never held the child Catherine had created through her violation of him, never had the chance to tell that boy the truth about how he was conceived. This is the story they don't tell about plantation mistresses. We hear about brutal male masters, about sexual violence against enslaved women. Those stories are true and necessary, but we rarely hear about white women who used their power the same way, who raped enslaved men under the guise of reward or romance or benevolence. Catherine Thornhill believed she was kind, believed she was different from her husband, believed her relationship with Jacob was mutual and consensual. She died believing that lie. But Jacob knew the truth, and so did every enslaved person who watched it happen. So did the community that raised his son as white, while keeping his father's people in bondage. This is the story of what happens when someone mistakes power for consent, when rape is dressed up as reward, when a night in her bed becomes 9 months of exploitation, ending in permanent separation and a child raised on lies. Catherine Thornhill rewarded her best slave with a night in her bed. What she really gave him was trauma, violation, and exile, and then she congratulated herself for being a kind mistress. This is the truth they buried. The plantation widow of Adams County, Mississippi, who believed she was being generous while committing rape, who believed she was honoring her slave while destroying him, who believed she was merciful while selling him away from his son forever. Remember their names, not to celebrate Catherine Thornhill, but to remember Jacob, whose name we don't know beyond that single name recorded in a bill of sale. Remember the son raised white, while his father died enslaved. Remember that power can never create consent, that kindness from a master is still mastery, and that the violence of slavery took forms we're still afraid to speak aloud. This is buried truths. These are the stories they tried to erase. We're making sure they're never forgotten again.